and she'd give me a call and said she has this sudden onset of panic and anxiety. Could she come and see me? Without elaborating too much and to cut a long story short, I booked her in for a session. She came along for a session. I said during the session who she'd seen, had she seen anyone before, what are some of the measurements she'd done to help her with the anxiety, the panic, and she told me that she'd had seen therapists and coaches before and tried to deal with the issue herself and so on and so forth, and had improvements, and she sort of took 2 steps forward, 1 back, 2 forward, 3 back, and was in a bit of a stalemate. Was in a situation where she couldn't seem to break through. And to my mind, I'd sort of gone over some of her files and notes and thought, okay, what can I add to this? Because she'd done a number of techniques, a number of things, a number of protocols, and I thought, what can I add to what's already been done, and what can I do different, or what can I do that has worked or hasn't worked? And I sort of devised a case formulation. Quite interestingly, when I did a time-on events and I gave her a thought diary and a mood diary to take away and complete as and when she could, and whichever way she could, the anxiety tended to escalate whenever she got home from work and had a meal and sat down and settled, and it kind of peaked at that point. Now, delving a little bit deeper and getting a bigger insight, a better insight into a certain situation. When we did regression, I regressed her back to early on in her life. I found through regression she'd been bitten by a dog. She'd been bitten by a dog when I regressed her. And at the point of when she saw the dog coming towards her, at the point of when she saw that the dog coming towards her, it created the fight, flight, freeze response. So you can imagine a dog coming after you, your automatic sympathetic nervous system response, and how it's going to elevate and so on and so forth. Such was the traumatic response, and the dog would go on to bite her leg and so on and so forth.
Nice to see you. Let's play.
It was quite interesting because then there was an implicit association to the dog next door was simply the one that had attacked her all those years earlier. So whenever she heard the dog bark, without realizing, because consciously she wasn't aware of the dog next door barking, consciously she'd have a focus on the TV, consciously have a focus on the conversation she was having with people in the house, so on a conscious level. So she'd relegate the dog barking or the sound of the dog barking to the unconscious mind. She wasn't aware of that. It was there, but not aware of it consciously. But unconsciously it was enough to cause a reaction, an implicit response, and to activate the fight, flight, freeze response. It was quite interesting really because she wasn't aware of it, wasn't on her radar, and I'm not suggesting that was the case. What I am suggesting that we done some work around that and it seemed to help her move forward far more rapidly than she had done before. Whether that's reality or not reality, one will never know, and ultimately it's about the outcome. So the key for your session, if you're a coach or a therapist, is have a goal for the session. I had a goal, and we had a shared goal. So the goal I had for her was to minimize her anxious response that was spilling into other areas of her life, because she'd settle in, and once she felt anxious, she wouldn't go to the store. After a certain time in the evening, she'd be social avoidance. She'd stay indoors, wouldn't go out to the gym, anything like that. So the goal, the shared goal, the well-formed outcome was to get her to get out there again, and was to go to the gym and so on and so forth, which she wouldn't do. And that being the goal, and one of the ways to quantify it, what I would do, that's measurable, going to the gym or not, is measurable, but also reducing it on a scale of 1 to 100, 100 being high, reducing. And this really was instrumental in going forward, because in life we have these implicit associations on an unconscious level, and we've got these schemas. And let's say, for example, very, very briefly before we proceed to tonight's seminar, if in your life, if you had a dog like this when you were 5-year-old, and it was a wonderful dog and you know, beautiful, it was a very loving dog, and you know, a fantastic, beautiful dog like this, you know, very loving dog, and your experiences were very loving with it. If you saw the same type of dog 20 years later, the same type of dog, what do you think your reaction would be? If the dog like this, very loving, and so your reaction is likely to be one of loving, and you see the dog in the park, you probably go up and stroke it, and it's going to impact your behaviour, your feeling, your emotion. So you see the dog, your thoughts about the dog, the beliefs about the dog is going to be, it's loving and it's caring, and your emotion is going to be one of love and care, and your behaviour might be to go pat it, and physically you might walk towards the dog. And now if early on in your life you had a dog like this and the dog was growling at you and had attacked you, then 20 years later your interpretation in the park when you see the dog is going to be, well, this could be dangerous, it could bite me. And it could activate your fight, flight, freeze response, because your belief is, your feeling is that you've been attacked before, you'll probably be attacked again. Emotionally, you feel scared, anxious. Your breathing ratio goes up and escalates. You get tighter, you get anxious, and you might fight, flight, or freeze. Now, if you never had an experience with a dog like this and never saw one in your life, and you had a completely neutral outlook to the dog, you know, and you saw it in the park, or if all three of you went to the park, you, the one who had a loving experience with the dog, and the one who had a negative experience with the dog, you might be arguing with yourselves. One might say it's dangerous, one might say it's loving, and you, somewhere in the middle, is neutral. So throughout our life, we build these core assumptions, these beliefs to specific situations, and many times they're quite implicit. Now, I reassure my clients when they tell me they've got anxiety that the brain's doing what the brain needs to do. Because many, many years ago, before I was around, if you went back millions of years ago, you had dangerous things roaming the earth. And our primary response, our limbic response, our amygdala, we saw a dinosaur coming after us. Just like if you saw a dangerous dog coming after you now, what would happen, do you think? Well, what you would do, you'd fight, freeze, you'd fight, you'd run, flight, or you'd flop, as they say. And now, from a dangerous point of view, millions of years ago, these things roamed the earth and they were dangerous, and it's perfectly understandable. And I guess it's understandable to a point if a vicious dog is coming after you. Yet, all that said and done, in the chronic the world as we know it is chronically agitated with fight, flight, freeze. Yeah, we don't have these anymore, but we have emails, we have social media, we have road rage, we have deadlines, bills, and external pressure, internal pressure, and all those things can activate the fight, flight, freeze response just the way it did all those years ago, because that part of the brain is still as it is back then. So we've evolved on certain levels, yet on that level, the brain is doing the thing. So, like I said earlier about that woman, she built an association. Now, the association in that situation came in the way of the dog barking when we regressed it. I went back, and that seemed to help her a lot, at least to have that awareness. And then we could apply some cognitive interventions that could help her restructure her thought process, and she got better. And she would go to the gym, and she would go out of the house, and she would do all the things that she wanted to do. Now, that was part of the case formulation, and I'm not suggesting that tonight. I'm not here to treat anybody or make any recommendations. It's purely educational. Each case is based on its individual merit and formulation, and certainly I tailor my approach to the individual, and I would always advise people to work in their remit. So if you're a teacher, work in that capacity. If you're a personal trainer, work in that capacity. If you're a psychiatrist, work in that capacity. So it's working as an extension of the skills that you already have. We don't want to become the resident psychiatrist, psychologist, we want to be the resident personal trainer. So it's helping the person achieve the goal that you have for them as part of your remit. And certainly this evening is educational, because as I mentioned before, each situation is individually categorized and based on individual. So tonight we're going to cover some really powerful stuff that I'm sure will help you. But one thing I would suggest to do, first and foremost, is have the goal and have a well-formed outcome, like I mentioned that when I was working with. And some of the goals were to get back out of the house and go to the gym, tangible goals, measurable goals. You can measure that. Some of the goals I had for her whilst we were doing hypnosis sessions were to reduce the, in a way of quantifying, say 1 to 100 being high, the level of anxiety that she had. Now, we don't want to label people as being anxious because they're not anxious all the time. We want to separate the behavior and don't want them to become part of the identity, so they conform to the identity. Yet, what we can do is understand more about what the patient experiences and the client experiences in their mind, what they see, what they hear, what do they feel. Because you mentioned earlier, the person who had a loving dog, they see the same type of dog and have a loving experience with the dog. What they're going to see is stroking the dog, hugging the dog, maybe kissing the dog, and their perception of the situation is different to someone who's been severed by a dog like that, or some of the neutral experience. So we have these representations in our mind for our senses: see, hear, feel predominantly, sound in the way of the woman, the barking, and also smell too, from a sensory experience point of view. And that can give us a good understanding as to what's going through the person's mind. And we can do disassociation and reassociation to the experience. So for example, someone who's in a plane, let's say someone who enjoys flying in an aeroplane, they're going to have an association to flying. Potentially one would think the destination, the holiday place they're going, it might be peace on the plane, relaxing, or it might be the experience. They'll see, they'll feel the emotions of maybe going away, perhaps. They'll hear the waves of the destination of where they're going. If they're going to the beach, they may hear people in an aeroplane happy. They may smell certain foods they like, or the destination. They may hear the music that is going on the plane, and so on and so forth. Someone has a bad experience of a plane, then obviously they're going to have the opposite of that. It could be the plane crashing. They might see the engine burning. They might see or hear or feel the anxiety. They might hear the engines a lot louder than what they are. They might smell the food on the plane. They might taste the food in the plane that they don't like. And that gives you an example of what we're referring to, really, in terms of how we associate to certain experiences. We can disassociate to certain experiences. And we can sort of talk about that as we go along. But I've done videos on the area. We're going to cover some specific stuff this evening, going forward. Now, there's many different types of anxiety and many different things that can cause anxiety. Tonight we're going to sort of touch on performance anxiety and just general anxiety. What I would suggest going forward is that anxiety can be, or have many underlying issues that we know. And certainly from my perspective, when I see a client, I would always advise them to, even when it's performance related, say they want to go for an interview, a presentation, or a sporting event, and they got performance anxiety, I would always say if you get them to go see a GP or medical expert, because I'm on medic, just to confirm there's no underlying reasons. Not being medical myself, there's no underlying reasons that the anxiety from the medical point of view that could be treated on that level. Let's not say that we couldn't treat them as well as, going forward if it was appropriate, but we want to sort of safeguard the person. And to give you an example, a few years ago I was delivering an NLP hypnosis course to chiropractors at Bournemouth Uni, and one of them talked a lot about somatic pain and mind-body, and how they treat it and so on and so forth. And to cut a long story short, I said, well, for me, if someone has any sort of pain, I'll do pain relief hypnosis. The first thing I would do is make sure that if they haven't already gone, for them to go get the pain checked out by a medical person, because pain we know is a sign. It's like knocking, isn't it, on the door, telling us something's wrong. Now, it could be mind and body, it might not be, I don't know, but I said to the chiropractors that, let's say someone's got a pain in the neck and you're treating them for 6 months, and then 6 months later it turns out it's a tumour then where do you go from there? So I suggested that nothing's 100% obviously, and everything's got its place, but my suggestion was to maybe suggest in certain situations, if not most situations, to rule other permutations, possibilities. Not 100%. We know that. That's the way I roll. Uncover every stone. I have a very holistic approach, and my goal is to uncover every stone to help the person go from A to B, but also make sure that we work in the best interest of the person in then improving, and that's one thing I would suggest going forward. So one of the things I do with my clients, be it performance and be it the woman who had that general anxiety I talked about earlier, specific anxiety, performance, going for an interview, presentation, or general anxiety, all things being well and equal. One of the things I do is I work on their breathing. So tonight I'm going to cover breathing. I'm going to cover very briefly the impact diet makes on anxiety, potentially. I'm going to talk about how we can tailor an approach with hypnosis with patients' anxiety, and I'll talk about how we can start to do cognitive restructuring. Now, I'm not going to have time to go into too much detail of all the things that I mentioned, but I'll go into them enough for you to either email me more resources, but I'll be doing follow-up sessions as we go along going forward. So breathing is an essential part for me, and one of the reasons is that people who've got anxiety, at least the people I've worked with over many, many years, they tend to experience tension and muscle tension and pain, and they tend to breathe high. They tend to breathe high in their chest. Now, if you were to sit there and breathe really high in your chest really, really fast, what do you think would happen? What do you think would happen if you were to breathe really, really fast, high up in your chest for an extended period of time? Well, your heart rate would elevate, that's for sure, and you'd feel nervous, you might hyperventilate. Now, it's a bit of a vicious cycle, because what's happening there is the sympathetic nervous system is kicking in. You're activating the fight, flight, freeze response. So it's activating that, so the heart rate goes up, and you might get sweaty palms, and you might get nervous. You've got adrenaline, cortisol coming into the body. And sometimes we're not in control of that because I'm unconscious. Like I mentioned, that woman earlier who the dog barking wasn't even aware of it. And sometimes we are aware of it. Sometimes it could be a big sporting event. So you might have a footballer taking a penalty and in a big tournament, and they could score 99 times out of 100 in training, yet the meaning they give the events, the meaning they give the goal, the expectation of the fans and themselves and their family and the weight of a nation and thousands of people watching, the meaning changes. Not just a penalty as one does in a training exercise. The meaning we give the situation has a big impact on our structure of reality, our belief. What the person thinks, if I miss this, I'll never get another chance, I'll let people down. What if I miss? And the hypothesis, and that's going to impact the person's emotion. They might get anxious, fear, their behavior, then they might go to type, back to a time that they didn't have a skill, and then physiologically they might start tensing up. And we see when someone takes a penalty and they're a lot of pressure, they take it like they didn't have any skill or they didn't learn the technique at a point in their life. So the sympathetic nervous system can potentially kick in there, and let's say you're waiting for an exam result, or you hear someone walk in a dark alley, you've got a sympathetic nervous response. Now, all things said and done, when that gets activated, we start breathing. So what I teach and it's for good reason in some situations, maybe not in a situation where you're taking a penalty in a sporting event, you've got to be calm, and there's things that we can do, and I certainly do some of the world's best athletes. I work for sports people and footballers. For presentation, I suppose you want some level of stress and some level of anxiety. You can channel into excitement or focus, just enough to manage the energy. You don't want to take and go and overwhelming you. So that's when the cognitive restructuring can come in. Another techniques we use, what we can do predominantly is breathing, because once the breathing is shallow, what we can do, and I teach my clients to do, is to breathe deeper. And they can breathe through their nose if they're comfortable breathing through their nose, not comfortable doing that, they can breathe through their mouth, but breathe deeper. So I'm going to show you how to breathe. So I'm going to stand up so you can see what to do. So I get them to place their hands on their tummy or their stomach and get them to breathe. So just above the belt line, if you can see, in the abdominal region, and they breathe deeper, and they breathe just like you would breathe when you're asleep. The body knows how to breathe. When you're asleep, it's very unlikely you have a panic attack, an anxious attack, unless obviously you've got some sleeping condition like apnea where you're struggling for air. But generally speaking, when you're asleep, we know that the body knows what to do. So you breathe in a way that's deep and relaxed. And when you're really, really relaxed and you breathe. So I teach them to do that. And at first it's quite challenging, because when you first start doing that with them, they want to go up here again. Especially when I do in vivo and replicate the scenario, like I did in vivo with the woman who had anxiety after a certain time, imagery, in vivo with the person who's doing the penalty shootout or the presentation, just replicate the situation as close as you can get to do imagery. And when I do that, and even when I don't do that, and I'm teaching them, they immediately want to put down. So just placing their hand back here again, and just breathing naturally and normally. Just breathing naturally and normally. There's no need to do anything more than what they can or can't do. Just breathe in a relaxed way. Okay? And you can follow them if you want to. And by doing that, you're letting the parasympathetic nervous system tell the body that things are okay. The nervous system can just relax. The nervous system, we can initiate the parasympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system tells the body, tells the sympathetic nervous system to calm down. And by calming down, the parasympathetic nervous system takes over, and the heart rate comes down. The sphincter muscles relax. Now breathing is more relaxed, and we can lower our heart rate, our breathing ratio, and we can generally manage the level of anxiety to a point in that situation. So I get my clients to practice that regularly. I get them to practice that as often as they can in between sessions. Let's say a session is every 2 weeks. I'll get them to practice it 20 or 30 times a day if possible. And the reason being is that the more you practice, the more it becomes an unconscious response. A bit like when you drive a car. Remember when you first learned to drive a car? First gear, second gear, you stall, and now you drive, you get in the car, you're just automatic. If you know where you're going, it's even more automatic. So can you imagine when you first learned to tie your shoelaces up, your brain and MRI scan, you're seeing lit up everywhere. Now you tie your shoelaces up without thinking about tying them up, you do it automatically. And that's the goal really, to get them to breathe automatically. And the goal is for them is when the sympathetic nervous system is activated and the body's implying something's wrong, and the heart rate goes up and the beating goes faster and they get tense and so on and so forth, then they can breathe deeper in a way they activate the parasympathetic nervous system. That then calms the sympathetic nervous system down. That relaxes the sphincter muscles, and they breathe easier and they breathe deeper. And by breathing deeper, and as they practice it, they then become second nature, and it becomes an automatic response, and they can control the level of muscle energy in their body, at least in that way. Now, they don't have to practice forever with their hands like this. Yet what I would suggest that they do for about 2 or 3 days to get used to it, do that. And then after 2 or 3 days, they can generally just automatically, natural and normal, unless they go back to do what they did before again, then they can do that, and that will help them. It'll become automatic as they go along. Their breathing will become automatic, and they can practice when it's safe to practice. I wouldn't suggest they practice when they're driving in the car. Yeah, if they're sitting at home and watching TV, they can practice before they go to bed. When they get up in the morning, they could practice when they're reading a book. If they wanted to, unconsciously, they could practice consciously as well. When they're waiting for a bus, they're waiting for a train. Just generally, they could practice if they're in a queue. Just practice, and in a subtle way, in the office at lunchtime. And the more you practice, just like doing any skill, the more it becomes second nature. And that's one of the first things I do. One of the first things I do with my clients who've got anxiety is get them to breathe, because it's tangible and it's measurable. It's measurable. There is a way of measuring it. I tailor the hypnosis session for them, and I record that too. And I get them to listen to the recording as often as they can, maybe 10, 12 times in between sessions. Say a session is every 2 weeks. And the reason for that, if I do hypnosis with them, and a session, if they're then going away and doing the recording 10 times when they've left seeing me until they see me again, that's 10 extra sessions they've done in their mind. That's obviously the pathways they're building in their mind, the reassociation they're having to the experience, and helping them also practice and activate the sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system, and they can do that the muscle exercise too. And I avoid using words like relaxed. And the reason I avoid using words like relaxed is because clients with anxiety have heard that 1,000 times before. They've told themselves to relax 1,000,000 times. Other people have told them to relax 1,000,000 times. And it's almost like their head's getting pecked over and over again. So what I do is I talk about controlling the level of muscle energy in their body. That's what I do. And the reason being is that that is more tangible, and I'll go into more detail as we go along. So the client says to me, after a session, they felt really relaxed, then I'll use the word relax because it's coming out of their mouth. It's not me imposing it. Because think about it, you say relax, it's almost like a command. Just relax, just relax, just relax. It's like a command, and they feel bad about the word relax. But if the experience is one that they come back and say, then I'll use that. If they come back and say to me, after hypnosis has been a pleasant experience, then I'll use the word pleasant, and so on and so forth, and I'll use the muscle energy, or I'll find a way for them to measure it in a tangible way, because as I mentioned earlier, there's a very good chance the word relaxed is embedded itself as the command, and they've probably been told by 1,000,000 times people before, well, just relax, because people don't understand anxiety, just relax, and there's something wrong with you, and they heard it before, and they keep telling themselves that they have associations with that word, and they beat themselves up more than what they need to. So one of the things I do is the recording, and they can take the recording, and the recording can help them to improve, and we can measure it through various ways. We can quantify it on a scale of 1 to 100, 100 being high. We can quantify certain experiences as well, and we can also do activation, or be able to experiment, and that might be the goal might be to go to the store. It might be to walk to the end of the road and see what happens. It could be controlled experiment we do where I go with them to the store and see how they feel and see what happens, and so on and so forth. Or we could do in vivo in the office and see what happens, and we go from there. So that's one of the things I do in the beginning, and the reason for that, then we can start exploring what their structured reality is, what their belief system is, what their hypothesis is, what impact the past is having on them in the now. In the case of the woman, the dog had bit her many years ago, regression, the impact it was having on her now and going forward. Now, the hypothesis could be they might be losing a job, and they might believe they're never going to find a job again. If they don't find a job again, they'll end up living on the street. Live on the street, they'll end up struggling, and if they end up living on the street and struggling, they're going to lose everything and not have any friends. And that could be the hypothesis that they're having in their mind, the structured reality. And we can challenge that through using questions like meta-model questions, arrow, downward arrow, Socratic questioning. We could understand the way that they perceive the situation cognitively, the distortion, which I've done a video in the past before. So, example, in the case of the woman I was working with a few years ago, well, it wasn't working with her on the full capacity. To illustrate, she was assigned to deliver training with me. We're delivering CBT training to staff in care homes, and she was really struggling with it. And the reason being, in our first session together, and she hadn't done training before, she replaced somebody else in her first session together. The feedback she got out of 20 evaluations, 19 was fantastic, was wonderful. One of them was quite negative, and she personalized it and magnified the negative. And the following week, when we're going to do training again, she goes, I'm really struggling to do the training. I said, okay. And I sat down with her to explore a little bit more, and she was personalizing the comments. She was deleting the good ones, and she was magnifying the negative one. And what I did to help her, is set up a behavioural experiment where she would go to the local speaking association and speak to people who just newly started speaking, public speaking. And by doing that, she get an insight to their reality. And they all told us perfectly natural and normal. So we normalized it. It's okay to feel that way. Yet all things said and done, there's a fine line between competence and confidence, where if someone said to me, do neurosurgery, I wouldn't do it because I'm not competent neurosurgeon. They do a lecture on what I do from the point of view of NLP, CBT, hypnotherapy, and all the things I've learned over many, many years, or physiology, then I would do it. So there's a fine line. She was more than competent, but she lacked the confidence, and we explored a bit deeper, and I regressed her. There was a situation where, as a 12-year-old, she got into trouble for not doing her homework at school. She was a bit of a goody two-shoes and got told to get to the front of the classroom and explain to the group why she hadn't done the homework. So she built an association, and that wound was opened up by that negative comment. So that schema, that assumption, was opened up potentially by that comment. So I set up the experiment, and she, by doing that, and then we did some imagery, visualization, rehearsal, and I'd use interventions aimed at the meaning, the presentation, her beliefs around presenting. We'd be able to label the distorted way she was seeing the situation, then started reframing it, seeing it differently, and challenged the structured reality. And then we also looked at it from an emotional point of view, and we talked about that, and I gave her strategies to regulate her emotion, and I gave her breathing strategies like we mentioned before, and behavioural strategies that would help her. Visualization, rehearsal, NLP anchoring, thought stopping, so on and so forth. And that will really help her to go on in a very short space of time to become prolific at what she did. Now, one of the things that we can do too, I mentioned before, is to do progressive muscle.